Hello everyone, welcome to the Daily Chess. Today we are back to our endgame training, day 7. Today's first position, it's around the topic of passed pawns, how to deal with them, how to use them. Both things we'll take a look at. This is today's first position, and yeah, obviously white has the passed pawn. Usually, when you have a passed pawn, it means you have a clear win. Where you have only kings on the board, not any minor pieces. We'll see at those scenarios again later. But in this particular position, the passed pawn is not too far away from the opponent's king or out of reach. In case this was a little bit further away, we would have been a different scenario. Okay, so we'll see why. And yeah, so let's start with what are the ideas for white. Obviously white has the passed pawn, so he'll try to get it queened, and the ideas are like either support this way if black king allows, or another is go around and then support, because right now in this position if you push, then yeah, the pawn is going to get captured. So here obviously white wants to push and queen up, but he can't. So he needs to just shuffle around this position. Of course it's saying draw, so it's definitely draw, but uh, can we use some of the older concepts here that we have learned, that we are going to see? There's just one tricky line here which we need to be aware of. So let's look at the ideas for black now. Obviously the first issue that black king is facing is this passed pawn. He always needs to be close enough so that if this pawn tries to queen, he'll be able to stop it. Why? Because of majority of pawns present and the kings also there, these pawns are not going to be able to pass and queen. The best case scenario that black can do is he can get the pawns exchanged, yeah, and there will be one pass pawn for black on the king side, and there will be one passed pawn for white on the queen side. Both can go up the ladder, and we've already seen what happens when simultaneously queening happen. But yeah, that's too far away and that's not quite necessary or reachable here. Basic idea is if this pawn is only one passed pawn is there for black and one passed pawn is there for white, obviously they'll go for each other's pawns and this will be a draw. So how can either of them make progress? First of all, white has slight advantage because he has the outside passed pawn, that I realized. Black always needs to keep an eye and be ready to capture this pawn if he tries to move ahead. And uh, what's the disadvantage for white? He also needs to keep track of these two pawns. If they get dropped, then yeah. So what's the trick? What's happening? Why any of them, either of them can try to win? So in this position, if black decides to just go and create the passed one, that's where the issue lies. Yeah, so the most natural move of g5 and exchanging this pawn is there, but we usually miss, won't even look at or consider the move g4. And why that works? Yesterday, or sorry, day before yesterday, we looked at the particular position of breakthrough, right? So that's what is going to happen here. So if takes, this is a pass pawn, and if black makes room for pawn, then this position also we know this is the square rule, floating square rule. Now this reaches to the end of the board, so either one of the pawn will be able to queen. Now there are two passed pawns. Now you'll say, yeah, but black also has three, but obviously white king is there to stop. Black king won't be able to stop all of them. So let's try to calculate what happens if you check. Obviously this and this is a draw. Why? Because this will happen and then yeah, black king will come in. So even in endgame you have to always be ready. The best thing to do here is just, I think, sit back with the pawn, because black king will need 2 to 3 tempis at least, right? He needs to push, and we can move ahead with either of them. And obviously this is winning for white. So the concept of breakthrough basically comes in here, that if black goes g5 hastily, which is the most natural move or what I'll play, to be honest, then there's an issue of this. This also does not work, because again black may try to go, but simply the square floating square rule still applies. Also black has 2 pawns, but white's king is too close. These 2 pawns are again too close. We have also seen in the same video that if the distance between these 2 pawns is less than or equal to 2 square, then the king will be able to capture both of them. So these 2 pawns, no matter what, are not going to queen, and these 2 pawns are going to queen. So basically, two key rules we see are overlapping. First is of course breakthrough, and second is of the floating square. Now, if you have less time, then this knowing these two rules definitely saves a lot of time, and you just directly know what to do. So this is the first version. So let's see what's the option for black. This is still draw, but only if king goes d6. Now this pawn is not going to go up, and moving this pawn is never an option. And of course white king is just not going to be able to move up and gobble up these pawns. These pawns basically cover all these 4 squares, and until the king is covering these 2 squares, white king is never going to be able to enter and capture this any of these pawns. So that is also a reassuring portion that we can look at, that can help us ease up the calculation. So if you have structure like this, you are controlling these squares, and if you are able to control this as well, white king is never going to penetrate, and these pawns just cannot move up. So yeah, white is also paralyzed. If white tries to support the pawn, then um, still nothing is there. Now since this king is slightly away and black has pawn advantage, then this works. Why? Because now g5 just g4 simply loses, because capturing this is going to promote, and if you so yeah, so basically g4 just doesn't work, right? uh, this is going to queen up, and if you capture, then this pawn cannot go up. If white tries to stay, then after this again it's losing. We don't even need to calculate that. So only option is white will have to go come here. Black will definitely push. Staying is not an option. Now if king moves, then this is winning for black, and if captures, then simply this is a draw. Okay, so I think this basically gives us an idea, or gives us insight into how we can use these basic concepts to ease our calculations and be precise in endgames, and how to combine couple of rules that we have learned. And I think that covers it up. Yeah. All right. So let's look at second position there for today. Straightforward position. This is also picked up from a game. Uh, let's start with analyzing what are the ideas for both sides, what black should look for, what white should look for, how to make progress, and how this is winning, and what are some tricks. We have seen so far that our initial ideas, the breakthrough, floating square, passed pawn, how to calculate whether it's reaching or not, uh, and opponent's king can interrupt your passed pawn or not. So we need to basically combine all these ideas. Think of couple more, like where to create your passed pawn and how. How you can create a passed pawn is a big plus. Okay, so let's start with analysis. So we know four pawns are in line. So all these squares, black king cannot enter, right? And this as well, since white king is present. So black king cannot enter your position. That is one. What's the issue for white? White king can never leave this pawn alone or one wander off too far away. Let's say here. Otherwise, this pawn will be able to queen. Yeah, so white king cannot wander too far away, and but he has the possibility of creating a passed pawn. In this position, the issue with black's camp is this isolated pawn do not give any chance for black king to create a passed pawn. Basically, you cannot make progress on the other side, the king side of the board. Only this pawn is the only advantage that black has. So it, I think this game position is little bit easier to play for white. Obviously, that's the first instinct any half decent player will get. Now, how to make progress? That's a big question. So, two key ideas I understood in this position. First, you need to make sure, or you need to look at creating a passed pawn as far as away from the opponent's king. Quite simple thing actually to understand, but in practical games I have never paid attention to that. I just look at pawn push, captures, then happen, okay, then I have 3 versus 2, then I'll push and I'll try to create a passed pawn. But that does not work. You need to look at creative ideas, and that start with understanding that this pawn is a very crucial piece on the board, because it's far away from opponent's king, and if this pawn is able to queen, or if you're able to create this pawn as a passer, then you're definitely winning as white. All right, so both players are trying to win this game. I'll say realistically, black king is not really trying to win the game. He should be aiming for a draw, because this passed pawn is completely blocked by opponent's king, and white can of course make progress if he's able to create a passer. Now, how to create a passer in pawn end games? Of course, the concept of breakthrough. So you need to understand that. In previous videos, we looked at this pawn, basically creating these two versus these three. In that scenario, the pawn was here, and you pushed f5, and you could make 2v3 that way. But here it's slightly different. You cannot push. It's black to play, but you cannot push this pawn and consider creating a passed pawn. Okay, yeah, that is still possible, to be honest, because again it's a majority. So let's start calculating and see some ideas or concepts. First thing we'll look at is what happens if just black tries to hang on. He knows he can't make progress on the opposite side of board, so he just stays there. So in this scenario, a very crucial idea is you push this pawn, h pawn, up to the board. Why? You want to get this pawn as close to the queening square as possible. So once these 3 pawns are exchanged for these 3, you'll have a passer very close to the queening. What happens if you go h6? Now that would be a very big blunder. Why? Because usually if you push h5, then any, I don't say a particular range, but yeah, I'll say I would have personally pushed this pawn without thinking, okay, these 2 pawns are there to keep a hold on this square. But the thing is, now the breakthrough happens, right? If you capture this, uh, just wins. I'll move the here, and no way the king is able to penetrate this square. So yeah, this pawn is queening. That's why pushing the pawn far away towards the opposite edge is the key. So h6 cannot happen. If your opponent calculates, then yeah, he'll try to hang back. uh, we go h6, and still if he's trying to hold on, then we can try to see how we can make progress, right? The idea is these two pawns, we need to put pressure on this position, but to push upon here you have to go through this pawn. What if your this pawn captures this way and you're able to push? Then it's a 2v2 scenario, right? 2v3 scenario. So f5 captures and pawn up. Now you're banking on the white is banking on the fact that this king will be able to hold these two pawns. We know if that this square, the floating square rule. Now both of these pawns cannot queen, okay, but a black king will be able to reach the opposite end. That's the key difference. So after f5, black can go a3. You will have to bring your king in, and this is something. Now of course your white is simultaneously trying to push the pawn. This goes here, capture captures, either this capture and this will queen, or nothing happens and you'll push the pawn. So after g5, of course b4, both pawns are you want to push. Now we know that this square is complete, and yeah, one of these two pawns will queen. Let's see how that happens. And b3, black has to push the pawns up the board. And if you go g5, then f takes, and then e3. This is a very crucial check that black needs to put in. If king goes here, then yeah, this is queening, so is this simultaneously will queen. Second is if you capture this, pawn comes up the board, and yeah, both the players will queen. So slight advantage is still with white. Okay, so this end game basically is a draw no matter what, but white has a chance to create a passed pawn, and because his passed pawn is up, will be up the board, black king needs to make moves, and there's a possibility that he'll make a mistake somewhere in between and lose the game. That's so key concept is push the pawns as far which are far away from opponent's king. Of course not blindly, you need to still calculate everything out, but this basically gives a good idea on creating how we can create pass pawns with breakthroughs. Now what happens if no h6 we saw why it's bad once, so let's see what happens if black instead of just holding on pushes h6. Because to be honest, I would have pushed this in my games. I most definitely would have. Basic thing that any 13-1400 rated players would consider is these two pawns are solid, I'm covering this square, so there's no issue. But again h5 will come as a surprise. This pawn has only 3 squares to queen. If these two pawns are moved out of way, this pawn comes up. This particular square will be generated, and black king is just not going to be able to reach this in time. So after this, if black tries to come in, it's still no. uh, it won't matter. Like you can go here and continue. Why? Because this pawn is not going to come up the board. You can capture, and you have a very solid for majority of 4 versus 2. And this still works, I think, or simpler way to play as a human is these 4 square are still not reachable, and this square is also, so black king just needs to hide. And yeah, that's all she wrote. Now this pawn is never going to go up, king can only shuffle around, and you have all the time to make progress. So yeah, e5 captures, and this is easy. You can even come this way, or uh, yeah, but I think anyone can calculate from this point on. So key idea was this h5 move. Okay, so we are in the last position for today. This is taken from the game Hansen versus Nimzovich, and quite instructive game. I looked at what we can do from both sides, what are the ideas, So in this particular position, it's quite tricky. If it's white to move, white will win. If it's black to move, black will win. Let's see how and why. First, we'll see it's black to move. Nimzovich won the game. So let's see how exactly it happens. What are the ideas? First thing you need to look at is, okay, these pawns of course are stuck. They are not going anywhere. Pushing this is bad, takes, and white king gets activity. If you The key thing to consider here is these squares are completely blocked. White king cannot enter. No matter what, these pawns are not going to get captured. There's no external pawn or anything to move them. So the only way for white to make progress is either get this king somewhere here. Okay, so king will be active because same thing goes for black as well, right? These squares are not reachable for black king. Just can't come in anyway, and it's a chance for both sides based on who can get the king activated first. Now this is losing for white simply because white's king will not be able to come in this way. Okay, his own pawn is hindering his uh, way towards victory. So in this position, Nimzovich had the correct idea that since white king is stuck behind his own pawns, particularly this one, he needs to get his king active. The key thing to consider is he knows his pawns are completely uh, unreachable. They cannot be captured by this king. So he is free to move his king, and he went king c4. Now, what are white's ideas? White to make progress, of course, he also wants to go to a5 square or overall a5 of the board. The shortest path would be get rid of this pawn and move the board. So what are the possible moves? c3 and c4, of course. The only possibility where the white has of winning is getting this pawn as a passer, right? This pawn is never going to be a passer because there are three pawns ahead of him. This pawn can become a passer because if this pawn gets exchanged, which is most likely with this capture, then white has a passed pawn and advantage, possibly the winning advantage as well. Now in these scenarios, uh, we need to consider, can this pawn or this pawn be used as a decoy to deviate opponent's kings, and then go for white can go for these pawns, move the board, gobble up these pawns, or black can use this pawn as a decoy, move him up here, and then reroute his way to capture these pawns and win the game. So two paths to victory: either get the king active or gobble up these pawns using this as a decoy. So king c7, and white has two options mainly, c3 or c4. What happens if c3? Now we need to be precise. We know that if black understands that this pawn becoming a passer will be a problem, also capturing these pawns means white directly gaining access and active king, so we simply cannot capture. If black understands this concept, then he is still winning. So king b6, of course Nimzovich knew this. He went king b6, and capturing is bad because I'll get the advantage. Now this simply does not work because king is active. White king will have to leave protection of this pawn. He cannot enter this square. If he moves, then yeah, I'll gobble up all these pawns. And if he goes a3, then I'll capture, and this also cannot move because yeah, this is queening. So basically this position is lost. After coming here, white player will understand, yeah, he's lost. So what happens if this, and he tries to protect this pawn? That case, this is losing, obviously. He can capture, then come and stop the pawn. There's no way white is going to queen this passed pawn. So having passed pawn is not enough. Yeah, the idea of considering this pawn as in future it will become a passer is good. That is a winning advantage, but not in this particular scenario when the opponent's king is just waiting at the doors. Okay, so c3, uh, the key concept is you cannot capture the pawn. Black sacrifices this pawn, okay, which we are seeing as a recurring theme. Breakthrough, even in breakthrough, you sacrifice a pawn to create a pasa. This time you're sacrificing a pawn to create an active king. And a5. So what happens in second scenario? What if white, after this, instead of capturing, white goes c4? Why? Because captures, okay, captures again. These squares are out of reach for white king, but he can try to come here and then hold, right? So what should you do? Should you capture the pawn and give white an active king, or you can still continue with king a5? Of course, the correct answer is king a5. If you push the pawn, then yeah, the, the white king can never enter. This is all he can do, just protect and stay passive. So we need to capture, but even capturing doesn't allow white king any squares, right? So to c4, king a5 is the move. If you go, white goes this, then that's all she wrote. There's nothing, no way coming back. You can't protect this pawn. If you protect this pawn is falling off, and this is simply winning. So you, instead of sacrificing this pawn, then you'll be sacrificing this pawn, and now here it's a bit tricky. Okay, now this is not straightforward. You can't just go king a4 and hope to win. Okay, here we have to consider second idea, the corresponding squares. One more idea of corresponding squares or opposition. Now we know this whole line is unreachable for both the kings. Okay, these two pawns are the only way to winning. Whoever gets the opposition wins. How opposition will happen? If you're in corresponding squares, whoever has to move will get the opposition, right? Whoever enters the corresponding squares will whoever enters the corresponding squares first will lose the match. So what happens here is, if you go a4, white will obviously try to come and protect. You cannot enter. Now here, if you go king b4, then white will get the opposition, and this shuffle will happen. That's all that will happen. So once you have the active king, you have to go here. What's the idea? The idea is, in this particular position, if it's white to move, white will have to move away here or here, and that's when black king can enter, right? So what we need to do, in this particular position, we need to reach with white to move. That happens when black is able to lose a move, and white is able to lose a move through the concept of triangulation. I think video number 2 on our page. So uh, you go a5. Now you don't do triangulation here, okay? You have to do triangulation this way, sorry, this way, because this basically, this square is a time bomb, mind square. You enter there and you get the opposition. So king e5. If here, then simply you will be getting the opposition, yeah. And now white has to move away. If your opponent knows that, he'll go king c2, king a6. White cannot make progress. If he goes, then I'll be coming in with. So what will happen? Will the white king just shuffle here and here? Nope. A5, and now you are able to penetrate, and that's all she wrote. Yeah. So we combined couple of concepts here. Here the key idea is, both sides cannot make progress. There is no majority on one side of the board and a pass pawn on the other. Here everything is blockaded, and when everything is blockaded, you need to make sure whose king is more active. How? If there were a couple of more pawns or something, then who is able to penetrate, whose king is able to get much more active? The only way to get an active king is from this end. right? Or this side of the board. White king cannot enter this side of the board. That's why white is losing. If you are a couple of moves behind in your game, maybe in the middle game, and you calculate this position, you need to understand, okay, this whole area is blockaded, and I won't playing as white, I won't be able to reach here in time, and that's why it will be losing. You don't need to calculate everything, you need to understand this, that this is a fact. Why? Let's flip the situation. Let's in the situation see if it's white to move. If it's white to move, white is going to go c3. Now this is too far away. Black king cannot get activated because of a4, and this whole area is also out of reach for black, and he'll win. Simple calculation. Hmm. This uh, eases out a lot of calculations for us, the concepts. So first we saw breakthrough, triangulation, floating squares. The key ideas in basically the end games are, if you're, can you make a passed pawn if you have a majority. If you don't have a majority on any side, like here 4 versus 4 is there, there's not a majority on this end, not a majority on this end. So can you if the position is equal, completely equal pawns, who has the more active king, can you penetrate in opponent's position? And if you can if you cannot, then can you create those ways to enter opponent's position? If you're playing defensively, you need to look at how can I stop opponent's king from entering my position and wreaking havoc. So yeah, I think that was it. The key concepts here are: look for passers, how can they be created, don't be afraid to give up pawns. This will be bad. Don't be afraid to give up pawns so that you'll be uh, for a better king or better or creating passes. I think that's all there is. Let's see in endgames can we use these concepts. Of course, this is just theory I've read once, and I'll have to go through games, play a lot of games, implement this with a calm mind, and make a habit of involuntarily thinking this, because in rapid or blitz, this is going to be key. All right. If you have any questions or any comments, please share. And like and subscribe if you are here so far.